Well, I think the chapters does challenge the conventional wisdom on this very much, actually, because I mean, it has been largely assumed that Salafis in Egypt were tightly connected to Saudi Arabia, and that assumption has been used to explain both the rise and the post-2011 political behavior of Salafis in Egypt. So the rise because it has been assumed again that the fact that Salafism developed very quickly in Egypt from the 1970s was widely seen as being a consequence of Saudi petrodollars and how they were poured into Egypt, and how that translated in the growth of the Salafi movement. And I think that assumption is not entirely wrong, but it is to be relativized. I mean, it has to be nuanced. And after 2011 as well, there's been many assumptions that the fact that the Salafis supported the coup, especially in 2013 against the Muslim Brotherhood. Again, there is this assumption that the Salafis were against Mohammed Morsi because Saudi Arabia was against Mohammed Morsi. And what I try to prove in the chapter is that it doesn't work. Again, if you understand the political logic that drives the Salafi movement in Egypt and that has driven the Salafi movement in Egypt for decades, you understand why the Salafis behaved the way they behaved after 2011. And it kind of makes sense that they would oppose the Muslim Brotherhood. And it kind of even makes sense that they would prefer the army to the Muslim Brotherhood. And you can explain that without having to resort to the idea that there's a Saudi conspiracy in there. So again, I'm not saying that Saudi Arabia is not an important financial supporter of the Salafi movement in Egypt. There has been Saudi financial support for sure. But again, I'm saying that many of the assumptions about that support and about the concrete effects that this support had on the ground are, as far as I understand, very much misguided. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and these movements of Islamic revival in Egypt goes quite a long way back. And Saudi Arabia did have an important role at certain moments in the history of those movements. Again, I think there's been assumptions that are misguided about how important that role was in shaping those movements. But that role was there very much and has to be taken into account when explaining those movements. For instance, I mean, the Salafi movement in Egypt, when it was established in 1926 with an organization called Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyah. That organization was actually acting in direct reference to Saudi Arabia and was indeed receiving money from Saudi Arabia. Later on, Salafism would gradually come to act more independently from the kingdom, and especially from basically the 1960s and 70s, where you start to see the growth of a Salafi movement that is completely separate from the kind of Salafi Saudi proxy that to some extent Ansar al-Sunnah was. So, on the one hand, you have, this, movement that was a Salafi movement that was supported by Saudi Arabia, but that was kind of, how could I say, kind of marginalized to some extent by another movement that grew in the 60s and 70s, the Da'wah Salafiyya, the Salafi call, and that movement was much more independent from Saudi Arabia, which shows you that when it comes to Salafism, yes, Saudi Arabia did have an important role at the very beginning in Egypt. And yes, the fact that Saudi in the 70s and 80s, distributed money to about everyone in Egypt in the religious sphere also did have an impact on the Salafi movement, but you cannot understand what happened in Salafism over the last 50 years through a mere Saudi prism. So, what is interesting, I think, here is to understand how much Saudi Arabia's influence was exerted in Egypt as much as Egypt's influence was exerted in Saudi Arabia. And in both cases, we need to understand those influences with a lot of nuance, right? So the fact that Saudi Arabia did exert influence through, money in Egypt doesn't make it that you can understand the rise of movements in Egypt through the mere prism of Saudi influence, although this did have an impact at times, and the other way around. That is the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood moved into Saudi Arabia in the 50s and 60s and contributed to the politicization of Salafism in Saudi Arabia is also to be taken into account. But again, the Muslim Brotherhood alone does not explain why people became politicized in the Salafi sphere in Saudi Arabia. So we need to, to understand those cross influences and analyze them with nuance, I think. What is also putting the Salafis in a difficult position is what is happening in Saudi Arabia, right? Although, again, Egyptian Salafis are largely independent of Saudi Arabia, contrary to what has been said many times. They do not take their orders in Saudi Arabia, and their religious views are actually, not dependent on what the Saudi sheikhs necessarily say. But it is true that what has been happening in Saudi Arabia over this last 6 or 7 years with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and his attempt to move away from a traditional conservative understanding of Wahhabism, all of this is having some minor influence on the global Salafi debate. So this also, in a sense, puts, Salafi movements across the globe under some type of pressure. Again, it is not that, these people follow necessarily what the Saudis say. So it is not that they will necessarily change their discourse because the Saudis are changing their discourse. But the fact that Saudi Arabia is changing, or at least is that the Saudi religious sphere is experiencing some kind of change, is indeed also, limiting probably to some extent the appeal of these movements.